It was a competition between the Soviet Union and the US, known as the Space Race, where they announced on July 30th, 1955 that they would be competing to achieve technological superiority in space exploration. The rivalry wanted to achieve superiority in space technology and capabilities and national prestige. Another factor was the events. First, the Soviet Union successfully launched the world's first artificial satellite on October 1st, 1957, known as Sputnik 1. This prompted the US to catch up and surpass them, so the US launched their own space program on October 1st, 1958, and created NASA as a response to Sputnik. This was the official beginning of the space race. The Soviets launched Sputnik 2 on November 3rd. It contained a heavier load and a dog named Laika. A female part Samoyed terrier was the first being to orbit the Earth. Sadly, there was no capability of returning to Earth safely, and Laika would run out of oxygen after 10 days. After the US created NASA, they chose 7 astronauts for Project Mercury. The goal was to focus on developing the needed technologies for a manned spacecraft. Then they launched the first satellite called Explorer 1 on January 1st, 1958. Its purpose was a part of the International Geophysical Year and a response to Sputnik. It carried a cosmic ray detector which led them to discovering the Van Allen radiation belts. The Soviets' reaction to Explorer 1 was a mix of disappointment and a renewed sense of competition. On May 15th, they launched their third Sputnik, and this one was designed to carry large amounts of scientific instruments and to also collect data on the Van Allen radiation belts. On April 12th, the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first person to orbit Earth. He orbited Earth in Vostok 1 for 1 hour and 9 minutes. Afterwards, he became famous and decided to never go into space again, but instead spent his time training other cosmonauts. This achievement was a major setback for the US. They reacted with a feeling of humbling pressure and urgency. The US wanted to do testing on animals before sending a man into space. They sent Ham, the space chimpanzee, into Earth's low orbit on January 31st. On May 5th, NASA sent Alan Shepard into space, but not its orbit, still making him the first American to go into space. Later on May 25th, John F. Kennedy made a public announcement that the US would land a man on the moon before the decade comes to an end. The US finally managed to get a man into space's orbit on February 20th, 1962. John Glenn flew in Friendship 7, making him an instant hero and showing the world that America was a serious contender in the space race. The Soviets had no care for their achievement and were more focused on their own space program. For example, they had achieved sending the first woman into space. On June 16, 1963, Valentina Tereshkova went aboard Vostok 6 and completed 48 orbits around the Earth. By the end of 1962, the US put in place the Apollo program. The program was made to land humans on the moon and safely bring them back, conduct scientific research, and show American capabilities in the space race. The Soviets had made a couple great achievements before the US. They launched their first multi-person spacecraft on October 12, 1964. Roskhod 1 had on board cosmonauts Vladimir, Boris, and Konstantin. Then on March 18, 1965, they accomplished the first ever spacewalk, performed by Alexei Leonov. He exited Voskhod 2 for 12 minutes and 9 seconds. Not long after, the US achieved those same goals on March 23, 1965. The US sent out their first multi-person spacecraft. Gemini 3 contained Virgil Grimson and John Young. Then on June 3, 1965, they accomplished their first spacewalk done by Ed White, exiting Gemini 4 for 20 minutes. And around this time was the start of one of NASA's space programs, which was Project Gemini. This program was made to develop and test technologies and techniques that were required for the Apollo program. The Soviets had made yet another part in history by launching Luna 9 on January 31st, 1966, and landing on the moon on February 3rd, achieving photographic data from the moon's surface and transmitting it to Earth. On March 16th, NASA had its first docking in space, performed by Neil Armstrong and David Scott on Gemini 8. There wasn't always great news from NASA as tragedy struck on January 27, 1967, when astronauts Virgil Grimson, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were killed in a fire during a launchpad test. The Soviets' first cosmonaut death occurred on April 24th, when Vladimir Komarov was killed by Soyuz 1 solar panel not deploying on a docking mission. On December 21st, 1968, Apollo 8 successfully orbited the moon with a 3-person crew that were Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders. In 1969, great achievements were made and also great failures. On July 16th, NASA launched astronauts Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins in Apollo 11 into space, where after 4 days they successfully landed on the moon's surface, with Armstrong and Aldrin becoming the first humans to walk on the moon. NASA had officially fulfilled President Kennedy's goal. This also meant the U.S. had won the space race. On July 17th, the joint Apollo-Soyuz mission sent 3 U.S. astronauts into space aboard an Apollo spacecraft that docked in orbit with the Soviet-made Soyuz vehicle. When the commanders of the two crafts officially greeted each other with their handshake in space, served to symbolize the gradual improvement of the U.S.-Soviet relations in the late Cold War era. This marked the end of the space race. The space race impacted technology, culture, and geopolitics. It brought great advancements in space technology. There were also some medical advancements, increased emphasis on education, inspiration for future generations, and national pride and identity.